another nature mission. This one's about mushrooms. And this is pretty topical for the region where we are in South Australia. This time of year is mushrooming time. And if you haven't really got your eye in yet, this is your mission this week, is to try and find a mushroom. They're popping up everywhere, and that's because this time of year the soil is getting colder. We've had a really good rainfall event, our autumn rain, and that's the break in the season. And around this time of year, this April, May time of year, is when we start to see mushrooms popping up. Mushrooms are part of this wider group of organisms called fungi. And it's pretty amazing because when you look at the whole of living things on the planet, fungi make up about 9% of biodiversity, and that's actually more than even plants and animals put together. It's a pretty amazing thing. So I've got a mushroom here to show you. This is one that I collected just in the paddock probably about a week ago, and it's gone actually a bit mushy. They've all gone a bit mushy. But basically, mushrooms are really interesting because they're part of this cycle of the food chain, which ties everything together. So we have animals and plants in the food chain that grow, and then when they die, we need decomposers to break down the material that they leave behind and recycle that back into usable components that the food chain can reuse. And mushrooms are part of this process. They're like recyclers, basically. So they're really special link in the food chain that really completes that cycle of living and dying and then being reused back into the living part of the cycle again. So the mushroom part, these are actually the fruiting component of a wider network of mycelium. And mycelium is like the spider web, it's like the web that is the organism that these mushrooms come from. So mycelium is like the bigger organism that this little mushroom had been growing from. And this just pops up really quickly. It's the fruit, it's the reproductive system of the fungi. But the mycelium that we can't necessarily see is all under the ground. And it's stretching out across the ground, it's connecting more fruiting material, but it's also getting nutrients from different parts of the soil and passing that back through the organism. Another cool thing about this mycelium is that it's transporting not only nutrients but also oxygen around the organism too. So if you think about like wet soils, it might be really soggy and damp, there's not a lot of oxygen in there, but the mycelium can be working its magic in those wet soils, producing more oxygen or creating more oxygenated environments there. And if you go to a wood heap, sometimes, you know, you're pulling out the wood and you'll see this sort of white, kind of like a bigger spider web. That's the mycelium as well. In those damp, woody areas, in a wood heap, there's not much oxygen there, and the mycelium's doing its job there too. And it's also breaking down that dead plant material. I've found some really interesting things out about fairy rings, because in the process of doing this I actually found one up the paddock, although it was only about a half a fairy ring, but it was a very unique pattern of a semicircle of mushrooms growing on the ground. And since then I've had my eye out again, I'm getting in tune with this, and I've found one on a neighbour's garden as well, in their front garden. So I've looked up a little bit about these fairy rings because it's kind of cool and they're unique. And I've discovered that some of these fairy rings can be hundreds, sometimes thousands of years old, because they start off the mycelium in this small small area, and they continually radiate outwards. So they're using and absorbing the nutrients they come across, and they're radiating outwards. They're fruiting when the conditions are right. They're fruiting to produce mushrooms, and then they just keep radiating outwards. And so some of these can end up, in theory, being huge, humongous, and be self-perpetuating and never ending. And they've found some of these fairy rings to be in areas that are hundreds of acres and could be thousands of years old, and that's a really cool thing. I've talked about when mushrooms might pop up, when the conditions are right, and that has a lot to do with moisture levels, temperature, but it can also be, especially in Australian environments, it can also be as a result of fire. So fire going through can really make changes in the temperature of the soil, but also in the chemical compositions in the soil. And that's where we might have mushrooms and different weird fungi popping up after bushfires have been through. The other thing that they're doing, they've got a job to do as well, and that is to not just break down nutrients and transport them, but also hold the soil together. After a bushfire, there's often very bare soil, there's no more growing matter on that soil, organic matter holding it together on top, and that's where the fungi come in. They're doing a job holding it together as well. So, as a bit of a mission this week, keep an eye out for mushrooms. You might find a few, some of them might be a bit waterlogged now because it has rained a lot, especially around where we are. But if you see some, just have a good look at them. Don't eat them because, they could be poisonous, and it's very hard to tell sometimes which ones are poisonous and which ones aren't. So don't pick them and eat them, but just have a look at them and really admire them because they are the ultimate recyclers in our food chain.